Hi everyone, I'm Florian Puhani. Welcome to my new training hack. In my last video, I dare say I've shown you a quite unusual exercise for tormenting the quadriceps muscles on the front of your thighs. Now let's see if I can match it with an equally novel approach to the back of your thighs, i.e. the hamstrings. Once again, this video meets a request by one of my viewers.
Scott Millen asked me for a novel approach to posterior hip and hamstring mobility. Given the complex issue of back pain he has to deal with, this makes totally sense. He wants to create adaptation in his hamstrings, which in this context obviously means he wants to make them more flexible. His preferred method for this purpose are weighted mobility exercises. And while he has seen some improvement with Romanian and stiff-legged deadlifts, those exercise variations mean a lot of stress for his back and therefore demand too much recovery time.
Well, thank you Scott for trusting me with this issue. In a minute I will show you my approach to hamstring flexibility, which I believe will reduce your recovery time significantly. But before we get to the hopefully novel part, I have an important caveat for my less experienced viewers.
Gaining mobility is a two-part endeavor. You need to improve flexibility as well as antagonist strength. That means if you lengthen a certain muscle group by whatever means, in order to be mobile, the antagonistic muscle group must be able to claim that extra range of motion. To take the strain off the hurting structures, mere flexibility won't be enough. You definitely need real mobility, for which Scott Millen himself mentioned a valid indicator in his comment. Sitting on the ground, back vertical and straight, legs outstretched. This position is made possible only by sufficient strength in your spinal erectors and hip flexors. Fortunately, the spinal erectors get to contract isometrically whenever we are working our hamstrings in the stretch position, which we will do anyway in a minute, but the hip flexors need some extra work. I will show you one or two common examples of that later. So now here's the first of the two concentric only exercises I recommend for hamstring flexibility. You could call it a pull-through, but for some reason I'll explain in a minute, I prefer to call it a sled hip-hinge. If you take a moment to watch this movement, you won't deny its similarity to stiff-legged and Romanian deadlifts, and maybe even more so to a kettlebell swing, only without the ballistics and the eccentric phase, of course. And yes, I'm aware this exercise has occasionally been shown on YouTube before. But since I'm responding to kind of a medical issue involving pain, I don't think I should care. Anyway, I will also show you one other exercise variation that I'm convinced is really new. So please don't get disappointed with my lack of inventiveness yet. For your convenience, I recommend you perform that kind of heavy sled dragging in a gym with a custom-made sled on a long stretch. But in case you have to or prefer to do this at home, here's how to assemble the necessary equipment. Technically, you could just use the double ring bell from my last video, which I've linked in the info card and in the description below. But you would have to turn it upside down. And since by nature of the exercise you need a very heavy load, it is easier to assemble it upside down right from the start, so you don't have to flip it over as a whole afterwards. A thick and sturdy cushion will protect your floor from scratching. The cushion itself, however, is likely to get worn out over time. So you best take one that has already been discarded. If you have enough space, experiment with the length of the strap. In my opinion, the strength curve of the movement feels more organic with a sled on a long leash. But unfortunately my dragging range here in my living room is very limited and I don't want to change direction after every 2 or 3 reps, so I have to compromise. Now for the execution. Step over the ring strap and take the ring in both hands, using an underhand grip. If you tend to have trouble with your elbows or wrists, you can also use a neutral or overhand grip. Thus, however, you won't be able to move as much weight because the transmission of the force created by your hamstrings will be less stable. Now start walking forward, taking tiny steps, while keeping your back arched meticulously. The latter is really important in order to achieve a deep stretch in your hamstrings. Obviously, you have to bend at your hips, but don't force it intentionally. Instead, just let your upper body get pulled down naturally by walking forward while your hands stay where they are without starting to move the sled yet. Stop as soon as you feel you couldn't maintain the lordosis in your lower back any further. At that point, keep your hip flexion the same, but increase the range of motion somewhat more by carefully leaning forward. This should be possible without the sled starting to move and you falling over, so it must be loaded heavy enough to prevent that. Keeping your knees slightly bent Romanian style will be easier on them, but I won't object if you prefer the stiff-legged version. Now induce the movement by simply hinging your hips forward. Don't intentionally pull with your arms. That's why I don't like the name pull-through. Just let your thighs push your forearms to the front harmoniously. Like in a kettlebell swing, you want to keep your front delts and biceps completely out of this. You can start slowly in order to break the adhesion without wasting strength. But as soon as the sled is moving, try to explode and gain as much momentum as you can. During the movement, your leverage is decreasing, so you should make up for that by overcoming the initial inertia of the sled. Otherwise, your range of motion would stay unnecessarily small. At a certain point, while your body is returning to the upright stand, your forearms will lose touch with your thighs. From there, you continue the pushing with your stomach against your elbows. You can keep them slightly bent in order to protect them, but don't try to biceps curl the weight forward. Stop pushing immediately as soon as the sled comes to a halt and start preparing for the next repetition. Since you're doing this exercise for the purpose of mobility, your focus should always be the stretch position. The first few reps will be tougher than the following ones because moving the sled decreases the initial friction to a certain degree. So it is advisable to load up somewhat more weight after 10 or 20 reps or so. Do as many sets and reps as it takes to thoroughly fatigue your hamstrings. Unfortunately, I can't tell you how much that is because it depends on your personal strength and stamina level. But don't underestimate the intensity. Keep in mind that you're basically performing rest-pause sets right from the start, because the time under tension is short in relation to the time it takes to resume the starting position of each rep. So a set of 20 to 30 continuous sled hip hinges feels actually much heavier than the numbers would suggest. What if your back starts to ache or is getting fatigued before your hamstrings? Well, in that case, it's time to switch to the other exercise variation I've mentioned before. That one is much easier on your back and basically isolating the hamstrings as much as physically possible. Of course, from hip extension, you can't totally exclude the glutes. I call this the stiff-legged hip thrust. Here, all that remains for your spinal erectors to do is support the weight of your inclined upper body. So, literally and figuratively, your back is off the hook now. Take the gymnastics ring off your sled and swap it for a round sling, or a dip belt, or a large lifting belt. Those are actually two lifting belts buckled together, by the way. You can put your pulling harness anywhere around your waist or hips and it will automatically slip down into the right position below your pelvis as soon as you bend over. If you want to perform this exercise completely stiff-legged and with a narrow harness like a round sling, you practically have to use the maximum length of the ring strap. Otherwise your harness will tend to completely slip down your legs all the time. If you don't have enough space and therefore need to keep the strap shorter, you have to resort to the Romanian style. Knees slightly bent, which will help you keep the pulling harness in place. Since the thrust is performed without the help of your arms and back, choosing the right load is even more important. I'm afraid it largely depends on your height and body weight. A 120 kg untrained obese person may be able to thrust forward a heavier sled than a 60 kg powerlifting champion. That's because in order to thrust effectively, you have to use your upper body as counterweight. And obviously the soles of your feet or shoes must have a really firm grip on the ground. Choose a weight that allows leaning into your harness to a certain degree, but not too far without involuntarily moving the sled. If you try to assume a ski jumper's flying position, the sled should definitely move. For the successful execution of this variation, your foot position is also crucial. If you place your feet too far to the front, thrusting with your hips will make your upper body rise to an upright stand, but the sled won't budge. On the other hand, if you lean into the harness with your feet too far behind, the sled will start to move even before you thrust your hips, and you will fall forward in slow motion. With a carefully chosen foot position, however, you will be able to bend your upper body forward with an arched back until you feel a decent stretch in your hamstrings, and only then initiate the movement. Extend your hips explosively by thrusting your pelvis forward and very slightly downward, while at the same time raising your upper body so you return to your initial, somewhat inclined standing position. You will notice that the hip thrust has a considerably shorter range of motion than the hip hinge. This may feel a bit unsatisfying at first, but on the other hand it will take more reps until you reach the end of the stretch, so you have to change the pulling direction less often. Ideally, your lower back should keep its natural lordosis all the time, but don't worry too much if you temporarily lose it during the hip extension. Just make sure you can still resume the arch for the next repetition. Even though your back doesn't have to lift any extra weight here, repeatedly bending over and rising again would fatigue it eventually. Finish the exercise as soon as bending over with an arched back becomes unusually difficult or even impossible. By then, your hamstrings should be at least equally fatigued. So if you want to include some passive stretching, now would be the ideal time. Then move on to strengthening the antagonists. Choose any hip flexor exercise that fits your strength level. Knee raises or toes to the bar, for example. Obviously, those will engage your abs too. But who would complain about that, right? Oh, and please excuse my sloppy form here. In this take, my hamstrings are actually pretty stiff and sore because in the process of experimenting and filming, I overdid it with the sled training on the day before. So yes, even though the loaded part of the exercise doesn't include an eccentric phase, it still can cause delayed onset muscle soreness, at least if you're new to it. But consistent with science, I'm absolutely convinced that after a few sessions, your muscular and nerval recovery time will be considerably shorter than from any kind of deadlifting. So you can do this type of training more often and thus reach greater mobility gains. And that, after all, is the whole purpose of this video. Now, what about presumably the vast majority of you who care more for strength and hypertrophy than mobility? Did I waste your time? I don't think so. Even though in this regard the eccentric phase would be indeed very potent, it is not the be-all and end-all of mass and strength gains. Sometimes a different stimulus like concentric-only training can be very effective too, especially if you've already reached the border of overtraining. Because then concentric-only training allows you to keep up your intensity and volume, whereas otherwise you would have to reduce it. Still, my main objective was to help Scott Millen and other people with a similar condition. If you think I did a decent job in that regard, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my channel. Also, please share this video with anyone who you think could be interested in it. If you also have some request or interesting idea, please don't hesitate to share it in a comment below or in an Instagram direct message, so maybe I can tackle it in another video. And thank you so much for all the likes, subscriptions and encouraging comments I already got from you. My name is Florian, and I will continue to make an effort so that you don't get bored with your training.